The gray light of dawn on October 21, 1805, revealed a sight of terrifying majesty upon the Atlantic swell. Off the rocky projection of Cape Trafalgar on the southern coast of Spain, two colossal fleets drifted slowly toward an inevitable collision. The combined armada of France and Spain numbered 33 ships of the line, and their wooden hulls painted in black and yellow streaks stretched across the horizon in a ragged crescent. These floating fortresses bristling with iron cannon represented the naval power of the French Empire and the last hope of Napoleon Bonaparte to challenge British dominance at sea. The air was thick with salt and the heavy anticipation of a violence that would alter history. Facing this formidable wall of timber and canvas sailed the British Mediterranean fleet, comprised of 27 ships of the line. They did not form a traditional line of battle, but instead advanced in two parallel columns that cut directly toward the enemy center. This unorthodox approach was a deliberate and dangerous calculated risk designed to force a decisive engagement before the short autumn day could end. The British sailors, hardened by years of relentless blockade duty, watched the enemy masts rise higher above the horizon. They knew that the coming hours would determine the fate of their island nation. The silence on the gun decks was broken only by the creak of cordage and the wash of waves against the hulls. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look to the cliffs of Boulogne across the English Channel, where the stakes were impossibly high. For 2 years, the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had assembled the Grand Armée, a force of nearly 200,000 soldiers trained specifically for the invasion of Britain. He required only a brief window of control over the Channel to transport this unstoppable force onto English soil. If the Royal Navy failed to destroy the enemy fleet, the wooden walls of England would be breached, and London would fall within days. The very existence of the United Kingdom as a sovereign power hung in the balance on this overcast morning. The man standing between Napoleon and global domination was a slight and battered figure pacing the quarterdeck of the flagship Victory. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson was already a living legend in Britain, known for his aggressive tactics and disregard for authority when it suited him. He had lost his right eye in Corsica and his right arm in the Canary Islands, yet his physical frailties only added to his aura of invincibility. Nelson possessed a unique ability to inspire absolute devotion in his captains, whom he affectionately called his band of brothers. He did not command through fear, but through a shared spirit of offensive zeal that permeated the entire fleet. The strategic situation leading up to Trafalgar had been a complex game of cat and mouse spanning the Atlantic Ocean. The French Admiral Pierre Charles Villeneuve had managed to escape the British blockade of Toulon and sailed to the Caribbean, hoping to lure Nelson away from Europe. Nelson had pursued him relentlessly across the ocean and back again, denying Villeneuve the chance to unite with other French squadrons. Now trapped in the port of Cadiz, Villeneuve faced immense pressure from Napoleon to sail into the Mediterranean to support campaigns in Italy. Despite his misgivings about the readiness of his crews, Villeneuve ordered the combined fleet to sea. As the enemy fleet emerged from Cadiz, Nelson knew he faced a difficult tactical problem. In the age of sail, the standard naval tactic was to form a long single line of battle and exchange broadsides with the enemy parallel line until one side withdrew. This method rarely resulted in the total destruction of the opposing force, which was exactly what Nelson required. A simple victory was not enough. He needed to annihilate the enemy fleet so completely that France could never again threaten an invasion. He conceived a radical plan that he discussed with his captains over dinner in the weeks leading up to the battle. This plan, known as the Nelson Touch, abandoned the safety of the traditional line. Instead of forming parallel to the enemy, Nelson intended to drive two columns of ships perpendicularly into the French and Spanish line. This would break their formation and cut off the rear ships from the center, and allowing the British to overwhelm them in a chaotic close-range melee. It was a high-risk maneuver because the lead British ships would be exposed to raking fire from the entire enemy fleet for nearly an hour before they could return a single shot. Nelson was gambling his life and his fleet on the superior gunnery and morale of his sailors. On the morning of the battle, the wind was light and the sea was rolling with a heavy swell from the west. The approach was agonizingly slow, with the British ships moving at barely 2 or 3 knots. Nelson ordered the signal lieutenant to hoist a message that would resonate through history. The flags fluttered up the halyards of the Victory, spelling out England expects that every man will do his duty. Cheers erupted across the fleet as the sailors prepared for combat, scattering sand on the decks to provide traction once the blood began to flow. The bands played patriotic tunes, and the men stripped to the waist, binding handkerchiefs around their heads to protect their ears. Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood Nelson, second in command, led the southern column in his flagship, the Royal Sovereign. His ship was a fast sailer and pulled ahead of the rest of the line, eager to be the first to engage. The French and Spanish ships watched the British approach with a mixture of awe and trepidation. They opened fire at long range, the sound of their guns rolling like thunder across the water. Cannonballs skipped across the waves, tearing through sails and smashing into the wooden hulls of the approaching British ships. The Royal Sovereign took heavy punishment, but sailed on in grim silence, holding her fire until the last possible second. At noon, the Royal Sovereign broke the enemy line, passing astern of the Spanish flagship Santa Ana. As she crossed the T, Collingwood unleashed a devastating double-shotted broadside into the vulnerable stern of the Spanish ship. The iron spheres smashed through the gallery windows and swept the length of the gun decks, killing or wounding hundreds of men in an instant. The Royal Sovereign then swung alongside, and the two massive ships began to pound each other at point-blank range. The battle had officially begun, and the orderly lines dissolved into a swirling mass of smoke and fire. Meanwhile, the northern column, led by Nelson in the Victory, aimed for the center of the enemy line, where the French flagship Bucentaure lay. The Victory became the focus of intense fire from multiple enemy ships as she made her slow approach. Shot after shot slammed into her bow and rigging, smashing the wheel and cutting down Marines on the quarterdeck. Nelson and his flag captain Thomas Hardy paced the deck amidst the carnage, refusing to take cover. The Admiral wore his full dress uniform with his 4 stars of knighthood clearly visible, making him a conspicuous target for enemy marksmen. The Victory finally reached the enemy line and cut directly behind the Bucentaure. As she passed, she delivered a crushing broadside through the stern windows of the French flagship, disabling her guns and causing horrific casualties. The momentum of the Victory carried her forward until she collided with the French ship Redoutable. The yardarms of the two vessels became entangled, locking them together in a deadly embrace. The French captain of the Redoutable, Jean Lucas, had trained his crew in musketry and boarding tactics, and they unleashed a hail of lead from the tops and rigging down onto the exposed decks of the British flagship. The fighting between the Victory and the Redoutable was ferocious. The British gunners below decks continued to fire their heavy cannon into the hull of the French ship, while above them the French infantry swept the British upper decks with musket fire and grenades. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of roaring cannon splintering wood and the screams of the wounded. Smoke billowed thick and choking, obscuring the sun and reducing visibility to mere yards. In the midst of this inferno, Nelson continued to walk the quarterdeck with Captain Hardy, discussing the progress of the battle with remarkable calm. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, a sharp crack rang out from the mizzen top of the Redoutable. A French marksman had spotted the distinct figure of the British admiral through the smoke. The musket ball struck Nelson in the left shoulder, smashing through his epaulette and piercing his lung before lodging in his spine. Nelson collapsed to his knees and then fell onto his side, his hand touching the deck. As Hardy rushed to his side, Nelson gasped, "They have done for me at last, Hardy, my backbone is shot through." The greatest naval commander of the age had been struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph. Marines and sailors gently lifted the stricken admiral and carried him down the steep ladders to the orlop deck deep within the bowels of the ship. They covered his face and stars with a handkerchief so that the crew would not recognize their leader and lose heart. The cockpit was a scene from a nightmare painted in red. The surgeon William Beatty was already overwhelmed with wounded men crying out in agony. Nelson was laid upon a makeshift bed of purser's bedding and stripped of his clothes. He knew the wound was fatal and told the surgeon to attend to those who could still be saved. Above the dying admiral, the battle raged with undiminished fury. The British tactic of breaking the line had resulted in a series of isolated ship-to-ship duels where superior British gunnery began to tell. The French and Spanish crews fought with desperate bravery, but they were hampered by the swell, which made aiming difficult for their untrained gunners. The British crews, drilled to perfection, could fire 3 rounds for every one of the enemy. Ships were dismasted, their rigging hanging in tangled ruins, while fires broke out on several vessels, adding the terror of burning timber to the slaughter. One of the most dramatic moments occurred when the French ship Achille caught fire. The flames spread rapidly to her magazine, and she exploded with a force that momentarily stunned the combatants across the entire battlefield. The ship disintegrated, sending debris and bodies high into the air before vanishing beneath the waves. The shock of the explosion served as a grim punctuation mark to the violence. By now, the outcome of the battle was becoming clear. The center and rear of the combined fleet had been shattered, and the van under Admiral Dumanoir was failing to turn back in time to assist. Down in the dim lantern light of the cockpit, Nelson clung to life, his breathing becoming more difficult with each passing minute. He constantly asked for news of the battle, demanding to know how many enemy ships had surrendered. Captain Hardy visited him whenever he could be spared from the quarterdeck, bringing reports of the unfolding victory. At first he reported 12 ships taken, then 14. Nelson, though in terrible pain, expressed satisfaction, but whispered that he had bargained for 20. His thoughts turned to his duty and his loved ones back in England. The Spanish sailors fought with particular tenacity. The Santissima Trinidad, the largest warship in the world with 4 gun decks and 140 guns, was surrounded by British ships. She lay like a giant beast brought to bay, her masts gone and her hull riddled with shot, yet she refused to strike her colors until she was completely defenseless. Her commander, Rear Admiral Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros, fought until he was wounded and the ship was a wreck. The heroism displayed by the Spanish and French officers and men earned the deep respect of their British adversaries. As the afternoon wore on, the roar of the guns began to subside. One by one, the French and Spanish flags were lowered in surrender. The sea was littered with wreckage, shattered spars, torn sails, and the floating bodies of the dead. The water itself was discolored with blood and black powder residue. The surviving ships of the combined fleet that could still sail attempted to flee toward Cadiz, leaving their captured comrades behind. The British victory was absolute, but the cost had been high, with thousands of casualties on both sides. In the cockpit of the Victory, the life of Horatio Nelson was fading. He felt the coldness of death creeping up his limbs. He whispered his final instructions to Hardy, urging him to anchor the fleet to ride out the approaching storm. In a moment of profound intimacy amidst the horror of war, he asked his old friend to kiss him. Hardy knelt and kissed his cheek and then his forehead. Nelson's last audible words were, "Thank God, I have done my duty." At 4:30 in the afternoon, as the guns fell silent, the spirit of the Admiral departed. The news of Nelson's death spread rapidly through the Victory and then from ship to ship. The joy of the overwhelming triumph was instantly tempered by a profound grief. Rough sailors who had endured the harshest discipline and the most brutal combat wept openly. They had won the greatest naval victory in history, but they had lost the man who had made it possible. The juxtaposition of supreme victory and supreme tragedy gave the Battle of Trafalgar a unique emotional resonance that would endure for centuries. The immediate aftermath of the battle brought a new danger. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke with terrifying violence. The gale-force winds battered the crippled ships, many of which had no masts or sails to steady them. The British crews, exhausted from hours of combat, now had to fight the elements to save their own ships and the prizes they had captured. Ropes snapped and hulls groaned as the vessels pitched wildly in the mountainous seas. It was a struggle for survival that lasted for days. Many of the captured French and Spanish ships were too damaged to withstand the storm. Some were driven onto the rocky coast of Spain and wrecked, while others foundered in the open sea, taking their prize crews down with them. The British were forced to scuttle several prizes to prevent them from being recaptured or becoming hazards. Of the nearly 20 ships taken during the battle, only 4 would eventually be brought back to Gibraltar. The storm claimed thousands more lives, adding a final cruel twist to the events of October 21st. The French Admiral Villeneuve was taken prisoner and brought to England. He was treated with respect by his captors, but he was a broken man. He had predicted the disaster and had been unable to prevent it. After his release and return to France, he was found dead in his hotel room with 6 knife wounds to the chest. The official verdict was suicide, though the nature of his death has led many historians to suspect that he was silenced by Napoleon's agents. He was the tragic scapegoat for an emperor who never understood the reality of naval warfare. When the dispatch schooner Pickle finally reached Britain with the news of Trafalgar, the nation was plunged into a strange state of mourning celebration. The Times newspaper reported the victory with black borders around the text. People celebrated the salvation of their country from invasion, but the festivities were muted by the loss of their hero. It was said that not a single person in England rejoiced without shedding a tear. The threat of Napoleon's army crossing the Channel had vanished forever, but the price had been the life of the nation's protector. Nelson was granted a state funeral of unprecedented grandeur. His body, preserved in a cask of brandy, was brought up the Thames to London. He lay in state at Greenwich Hospital, where thousands queued to pay their respects. On the day of the funeral, a massive procession accompanied his coffin to St. Paul's Cathedral. The sailors of the Victory walked in the procession, carrying the shot-torn colors of their ship. At the moment the coffin was lowered into the crypt, they tore the flag apart, and each man kept a piece as a holy relic. The strategic consequences of Trafalgar were immediate and far-reaching. Napoleon abandoned his plans for the invasion of Britain and turned his armies east to face Austria and Russia. He would go on to win great victories on land, but he was forever confined to the continent. The Royal Navy had secured undisputed command of the oceans, a dominance that would last for more than a century. This maritime supremacy allowed Britain to build a global empire and control the trade routes of the world, ushering in the era of Pax Britannica. The Battle of Trafalgar also marked a turning point in naval tactics. The rigid adherence to the line of battle was discarded in favor of more aggressive and flexible strategies. Nelson's example taught future generations of naval officers the value of initiative and the importance of destroying the enemy rather than merely defeating them. The Nelson touch became a subject of study in naval academies around the globe, influencing commanders well into the age of steam and steel. HMS Victory, the silent witness to these events, was preserved as a national monument. She sits today in dry dock at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, the oldest naval ship still in commission. Visitors can walk the same decks where the sailors fought and stand on the spot where Nelson fell, which is marked by a brass plaque. The ship serves as a tangible link to the past, allowing us to touch the wood and smell the tar of the 18th century Navy. The human cost of the battle was staggering. The combined fleet suffered over 13,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. The British losses were approximately 1,700. The surgeons on both sides worked tirelessly in horrific conditions, amputating limbs and binding wounds by candlelight. The survival of so many men was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the grim determination of the medical staff. For the survivors, the scars of Trafalgar would last a lifetime. Napoleon never accepted the reality of his naval defeat. He continued to build ships, but he could never replace the experienced sailors lost at Trafalgar. The psychological impact on the French Navy was devastating. For decades, French admirals would remain defensive and hesitant in the face of the Royal Navy, constantly looking over their shoulders for the next Nelson. The ghost of the little admiral haunted the French strategic imagination long after his body was laid to rest. The legacy of Trafalgar extends beyond military history. It shaped the geopolitical map of the modern world. Because Britain controlled the seas, she was able to support resistance movements against Napoleon in Spain and Portugal, and eventually land the army that would defeat him at Waterloo. The English language and British legal institutions spread across the globe, carried by the ships that Nelson's victory had secured. The world we live in today is in many ways a product of that autumn afternoon off the coast of Spain. In Trafalgar Square in the heart of London, the statue of Horatio Nelson stands atop a granite column looking down towards the Houses of Parliament. 4 bronze lions guard the base cast from the melted-down cannons of the captured French fleet. It is a monument not just to a man, but to a moment when the course of history turned on the courage of a few thousand sailors. The Battle of Trafalgar remains the defining epic of the Age of Sail, a story of genius, bravery, and sacrifice that will never fade. As we look back on the events of October 21, 1805, we are reminded of the fragility of nations and the impact of individual leadership. Nelson's masterstroke was more than a tactical gamble, it was an assertion of national will. He asked his men to do their duty, and they delivered a victory that echoed through the ages. The sun set on Cape Trafalgar that day over a scene of destruction, but it rose the next morning on a world that had been irrevocably changed.